Welcome to the Just Third Way podcast, where we ask the question, would you rather own or be owned? Brought to you by the Center for Economic and Social Justice at cesj.org. Hello, thanks for tuning in to the podcast. Today we have the Plutocracy Story of the Week, and then we'll get into today's podcast, which is a review of the greatest Halloween horror blog posts on the Just Third Way blog by Michael Greaney. Pretty entertaining stuff, one of my favorites. But first, the Plutocracy Story of the Week. There is a story in The Guardian this week, which is a British publication. It talks about the wealth of America's three richest families and focuses a lot on how they have influenced government in order to become dynastic, I guess you could say. And it's a pretty interesting story. I think, in a way, it takes someone from another country to report this way, to look at our country. It's easier to be critical of a different country's system when it's evident that there is a major flaw. So I don't think you see anything quite this critical very often in major American publications. So I'm going to read a few excerpts from this thing. The headline says, "The wealth of America's three richest families grew by 6,000% since 1982. And it's an opinion piece by a fellow named Chuck Collins. He says, 3 U.S. families have a combined wealth of $348.7 billion. As their generations expand, we are drifting towards a society governed by the rich. It hardly makes news anymore that the U.S. is becoming an extremely unequal country. Each year, new eye-popping statistics juxtapose the reality of decades of stagnant wages for half the country's workers with today's extreme concentrations of wealth and power. The top 3 wealthiest billionaires in the U.S., Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, and Warren Buffett, now have as much wealth as the bottom half of the U.S. population combined. This is possible because the bottom fifth of U.S. households are underwater, with zero or negative net worth. And the next fifth has so few assets to fall back on, they live in fear of destitution. We're developing into a plutocracy, said the former Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker. Interesting that, I guess a lot of people picked up on what I was talking about last week. Interesting when someone as influential and as, much a key part of the system in recent history says something like that. So anyway, back to the article. One troubling indicator that we are drifting toward a society governed by the wealthy is the expanding fortunes of multi-generational wealth dynasties. The 3 wealthiest U.S. families are the Waltons of Walmart, the Mars Candy family, and the Koch brothers, heirs to the country's second largest private company, the energy conglomerate Koch Industries. These are all enterprises built by the grandparents and parents of today's wealthy heirs and heiresses. These 3 families own a combined fortune of $348.7 billion, which is 4 million times the median wealth of a U.S. family. Since 1982, these 3 families have seen their wealth increase nearly 6,000%, factoring in inflation. Meanwhile, the median household wealth went down 3% over the same period. The dynastic wealth of the Walton family grew from $690 million in 1982, or $1.18 billion in 2018 dollars, to $169.7 billion in 2018. A mind-numbing increase of more than 9,000%. This isn't the normal physics of wealth in the U.S., where we've traditionally abhorred the idea of hereditary wealth and power. Since 1900, most grand fortunes have been dispersed by the time the great-grandchildren come around, hence the old adage, shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. Usually wealth diminishes over multiple generations as money is spent, passed down to heirs, given to charity, and paid in taxes. Only when families aggressively intervene to arrest this cycle does wealth continue to expand over multiple generations, even as the number of heirs increases. Several dynastic families have used their considerable clout to stage just such an intervention, spending millions to save themselves billions. They've lobbied Congress to tip the rules in favor of dynastic wealth, including tax cuts and public policies that will further enrich their enterprises. In the early 2000s, the Mars, Walton, and Gallo families actively lobbied to abolish the federal estate tax, a tax paid exclusively by multimillionaires and billionaires. The Koch brothers have since organized their famous donor network to lobby for tax cuts for the rich and roll back regulations on the energy industry, the source of their wealth. Others aggressively use dynasty protection techniques to hide wealth and transfer it to heirs. They hire armies of tax accountants, wealth managers, and trust lawyers to create trusts, shell corporations, and offshore accounts to move money around and dodge taxation and accountability. For example, the casino magnate Sheldon Adelson, number 15 on the Forbes 400 list, has used complicated trust mechanisms to pass on $7.9 billion to his children while avoiding $2.8 billion in gift and estate taxation. Adelson recently broke spending records on midterm elections with more than $100 million in campaign donations. And it goes on, and it talks about how Warren Buffett is, not leaving his kids as much and how he's virtuous or whatever. But, I actually communicated some with one of his kids, Peter Buffett. I was trying to get involved with some of the charitable stuff he's doing. And he was not very positive about the concept of ownership. So it is kind of interesting that our ideas about ways to have widespread ownership to combat some of these ridiculous concentrations of wealth are not necessarily supported, even though you think they would be, by people who are affected by it. So kind of strange the way that works. And probably just as significant as spreading the ownership to many people, capital homesteading would fight these types of concentrations, because as it is, we're creating money for so many things such as government waste, frivolous debt, consumer debt, speculation, that all of this money is intended to help the economy, but a very small amount of it actually stays in the actual, active portion of the money, and it ends up in the hands, of these few who have figured out ways to set up systems to concentrate the wealth to themselves. So the money system itself is creating these huge concentrations of wealth. And that's something that not enough people talk about. It's like they say the money is going to a certain place, but they don't say that money itself is flawed. So that would certainly change things if we had money created only for real productive growth, when a legitimate business transaction that's considered feasible, that involves new growth, if you only created money for that, and then the people who are involved in that activity would benefit far more than those few who own the large corporations. I think it is interesting that these wealthy families that have these large businesses have paid to sort of keep their corner on the market. One thing that I wonder a lot about is the role of government in fighting monopolies. And should we not be getting a little more creative in how government fights monopolies? And should we not be paying more attention to that subject? People certainly did pay attention to it back in the days of Standard Oil and, the railroads, that it was very popular to talk about stopping these huge monopolies. But there's just not much discussion about it today. And apparently behind the scenes, the lawmakers are being paid to not talk about it. And probably the media is being paid to not talk about it. So that's a big subject that I would like to see more discussion. And one way to certainly fight monopolies is to have employee ownership, because this concentrated pool of money with a few people, it wouldn't be, paying to keep it going if the employees were cut in on ownership. And if we had things like capital homesteading, where the profits went to, large numbers of people. So I think that's an important thing. We need to talk more about monopolies. And speaking of how these people kind of run things, it's just ironic that I happened to go to church and listen to a preacher named Andy Stanley, and he was reading from, or preaching a story from the book of James, talking about rich people hoarding and things like that. And I had never heard this verse before, and it certainly relates to what we do. He's talking to rich people. James, I guess he was the sort of pastor of the Christian church in Jerusalem. And he was talking to rich people, and he said, "Look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty." So kind of relates to what we do, and I'd never heard it before. But I just wanted to go over that information and talk about it a little bit. I think the just third way is the best way to combat some of these problems. As far as the death tax, estate tax, they will always find ways around it. So it's not the most effective tax. But I believe that CESJ's proposal of taxing the recipient is a very good one, because if you tax the recipient over a certain relatively large amount, then that encourages the person who is, setting up the trust to plan for succession will include as many people as possible to spread it around. If they want to avoid taxes, they can spread it to as many people as possible. So I think that's a pretty good way to do something different. So anyway, that's the plutocracy story of the week. Just some really crazy numbers about concentration of wealth. And it's really, really sad that, the average working American has not increased their income and wealth in really a generation. So just thought I would pass that on as the plutocracy story of the week. So on to the main subject of today's podcast, which is Halloween horror. Mike Greaney has written quite a few blogs through the years, and one of the more entertaining series that he has written is called Halloween Horror Special, and he does them usually in the month of October, and some of them are pretty entertaining. So since I was kind of putting this together about the time of Halloween, I thought I would go ahead and read a few of my favorites to you. One of them is from Tuesday, October 11th of 2011. It's called Halloween Horror Special 5, The Invisible Government. so I'm just going to read it, and I might have a few things to say about it. A standard plot for cheap rip-off horror films and cheap parodies of cheap rip-off horror films is the Invisible Man, who is either insane to begin with or becomes insane as a direct result of the invisibility serum/machine process magical spell. People, usually pretty girls who can hold the backs of their hands to their mouths and scream piercingly while exhibiting impeccable dentition, die more or less horribly, albeit in black and white, which is less bloody and more Hershey syrupy, usually without knowing what the heck is killing them, or at least wondering how that butcher knife can float around in the air. While the audience knows what is going on, at least 3/4 of the movie is spent watching the people on the screen develop theories to explain the carnage, identify the wrong villain, run around doing exactly the wrong thing, and so on, until somebody finally figures out that, by Godfrey Daniels, it's an invisible man. Fast forward to our feature presentation. The economy is going bawoosh. Everybody and his brother seems to be running around blaming everybody else and his brother and looking to the government for salvation. Unfortunately, out here in the audience in CESJ land, we already know that the invisible man who's been running around wreaking havoc is the very government that people are looking to for help. Obviously, this also works with blood-sucking vampires who, to the surprise of the characters, turns out to be the most obvious participant in the drama. That's why it's not really a surprise that the Nobel Prize for the Obvious has again been awarded. 2 Americans received the prize for economics for their empirical research on cause and effect in the macroeconomy. As the news reports report, the 2 laureates, both 68, have developed methods to examine cause and effect when it comes to questions such as how economic growth and inflation are influenced by a temporary increase in interest rates or a tax cut. Not how the government affects the economy or to what degree, that's a given. What these geniuses have discovered is how to detect the interference. In other words, the 2 Harvard economists have worked out new ways to figure out how the government baffles people about the cause of the adverse effects when the state screws around with the free market, goes insane, and embarks on a killing spree. We mean engages in another round of quantitative easing to bring the economy back to life. It's alive, they exult. Not really. It's just flopping around on the table as it breathes its last gasp. Obviously, this also works with Frankenstein's monsters manufactured out of spare parts, a rather neat metaphor for the patchwork monetary and fiscal policy in place throughout virtually the entire world. Actually, this works with just about any type movie monster you can imagine. The only question is when people are going to realize that the one they've been looking to for a solution is the one strewing bodies all over the landscape. Another great Halloween horror blog posting on the Just Third Way blog by Mike Greaney is Halloween Horror Special 13, Mean Green Mother from Outer Space. And this was republished on October 26th of 2015. So I guess he edited it a little bit then. I'll read that version. We think we finally understand Keynesian economics. Frightening as that thought is, it's an essential first step in helping people to understand the alternative that the natural law, social justice, and binary economics offers. Because it integrates binary economics as well as the act of social justice, the Just Third Way has the potential to remedy the massive and seemingly unavoidable problems caused by reliance on Keynesian economics as the ideal model for global economic, financial, and political systems. First, of course, Keynesian economics is directly contrary to the precepts of the natural law. It effectively abolishes private property and free association, calls into question the right to life, and redefines what it means to pursue happiness, that is, acquire and develop virtue. In Keynesian economics, the ordinary human person is reduced to the status of Homo economicus, that is, a purely economic unit whose human needs may be satisfied with a bare modicum of material goods, but whose wants are insatiable. This actually contradicts the theory of marginal utility, but it's not clear that Keynes was ever completely consistent in anything. The observation that Keynesian economics is directly contrary to the precepts of the natural law leads to a breakthrough realization. That is, Keynesian economics is not from this earth. Keynesian economics is from another planet. Does this mean that Keynes himself was an alien being, and that Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones failed in their mission to protect the earth from the scum of the universe? It would make sense, but, reluctantly, our in-depth investigation of Keynes and study of his thought reveals something even more sinister. It turns out that Keynes was an unwitting dupe of a highly evolved vegetative conspiracy intended to turn humanity into plant food. This was first chronicled by Roger Corman and Charles B. Griffith in the 1960 fact-based allegory, The Little Shop of Horrors. The film was discredited, first by changing the title from the more descriptive The Passionate People Eater, then by spreading the rumor that Corman and Griffith wrote the script overnight while drunk and filmed the movie in 2 days. When the message failed to penetrate the inner sancta of academia and politics, it was remade into an off-Broadway musical, and then into another documentary in an all-out effort to wake people up. Since the situation had only gotten worse in the interim, the message was made more explicit, as can be seen in this clip, in which one of the alien beings reveals why it has duped Keynes into promoting economic principles and theories that bear absolutely no relation to reality. The alien tells the character representing Keynes, played by Rick Moranis, that the goal is world conquest. Humanity is simply a source of food for the aliens, and the sooner civilization is destroyed by Keynesian economics, the better. The one bright spot is that between 1960 and 1986, when the second effort was released in theaters, Louis Kelso and Mortimer Adler wrote The New Capitalists. The subtitle of the book gives the human race the ultimate solution to the slavery of savings into which Keynesian economics has bound the human race, a proposal to free economic growth from the slavery of past savings. Serious students of the cinema will immediately understand the significance of the electrical jolt that binary economics gives to Keynesian economics, blowing apart its complete reliance on past savings and ending the alien threat represented by Keynesian economics. Of course, since, as Father William Faree pointed out in Introduction to Social Justice, the work of social justice is never done, the very end of the film reminds us to remain vigilant, lest Keynesian economics once again grow up among us. Nowhere is the alien nature of Keynesian economics better illustrated than in the way it relies on inflation and consumer credit to run an economy. There is no other way to explain how, in an economy that has the capacity to produce far more than is necessary to provide a comfortable life for everyone, there is want, even desperate need. How can that be? Because the alien idea has intruded that the only way to finance new capital formation is by cutting consumption and saving. The problem is that the rich are already saving. In fact, their savings are already invested in new capital, and, of course, old capital. Where do we get the additional savings? From wage workers. Through artificially induced inflation, prices that wage workers have to pay go up. This forces wage workers to cut consumption, thereby generating the savings necessary to finance new capital formation. The savings are passed on to producers in the form of profits, thereby putting money into the hands of people who will use it for reinvestment rather than its proper use of consumption. This, however, means that the economic dilemma kicks in. Keynesian economics is based on the assumption that without the savings generated by cutting consumption for financing, there will be no new capital formed. At the same time, without the consumption to provide the incentive for producers to invest in new capital, there will be no new capital formed. People do, after all, have to buy the goods and services produced. Or do they? Keynesian economics stipulates that when people are unemployed and not producing, they should be put to work producing goods and services that cannot be marketed. The sole purpose of this useless production is to generate effective demand by wage workers without increasing the supply of marketable goods and services by having them produce anything of value, i.e., marketable goods and services. Why must you not increase the supply of marketable goods and services? Because increasing production increases supply and drives prices down, and you need to drive prices up in order to force people to cut consumption. In Keynesian economics, the economy is better off if you produce nothing and the state just prints money and gives it to you. The problem is that there's only so much in the way of unmarketable goods and services you can produce before things start to fall apart. The answer? Consumer credit. This is because consumer credit increases effective demand without producing any good or service, marketable or unmarketable. The downside is that, in the long run, borrowing today requires that you repay tomorrow. Eventually, that means that the income you get tomorrow cannot be saved because it was spent today or yesterday. It can't be saved because it was already consumed. The only way out is for consumers overburdened with debt to declare bankruptcy. True, this stiffs the producers that sold on credit, but the government can bail them out. It also gives the consumers a clean slate so they can borrow more money, then declare bankruptcy again, while the government creates more money to bail out producers. Is there any question that this is an alien conspiracy? The creature in Little Shop of Horrors made this perfectly clear with its demands to be fed constantly on the life's blood of humanity, an obvious allegory for the misuse of credit, the life's blood of the economy, with the goal of world conquest. Of course, we could also just get rid of the whole Keynesian shtick and go with a more common-sense solution, say capital homesteading. Or is that just too wild and unbelievable compared with the surreality of Keynesian economics? Feed me, Seymour. So that's the end of that one, and that's the end of the podcast today. But I hope to hear from you guys soon, and have a great week. You can join CESJ by going to cesj.org and clicking on Participate, and you can become a paying member for $25 per year, and also a student membership is $15 per year, and that qualifies you for discounts on our materials, such as books, which you can buy many of and distribute to your friends and family. And also, if you'd like to participate and comment on the podcast, feel free to call. I have a voicemail set up. I'd like to hear what you have to say, and I'll play it on the podcast. The number is 678-719-2840. Own or be owned.